XML systems are all based on files. Everything in an XML system is a file, and you'll see throughout this course that you'll be uploading various files, and we'll be testing those files against a standard for that file to see how close you got to that standard. So it's all about files. There are 4 basic types of files that we're going to work with in XML. The first one is the instance file, .xml. Right? A .xml file is called an instance file, and that instance file has our information in it. From the standpoint of information types, items, and access structures, the instance file contains the items. It also contains the data that's necessary to build the access structure, but more or less that's what we're going to think about it as. It's the content, it's the information, it's the stuff itself is in the instance file. So a question you might have is, instance, why is it called an instance? The XML file, the instance file, is an instance of the schema. The schema is the form, the schema is the mold, and the instance is an instance of it. So that's why it's called an instance document, because it's an instance of some schema. The schema defines the rules, and the .xml file is an instance of those rules. Now we can look at it the other way, talking about the second type of XML file now, the schema file. The schema file is a set of rules. Those rules apply or validate an instance. If the instance is an instance of a schema, turning that relationship around, we can say the instance validates the schema. The instance says, yes, you are a valid instance of me. You obey all the rules. You're as I expect you to be. So type number 1 is the instance. The instance contains the data or the information. It contains the items. Type number 2 is the schema. The schema is the rules. The instance obeys the rules. The schema is also, from our standpoint of our information structure concepts, it contains the information type. It contains the rules of what it means to be that type. It also defines the access structure. It says what's the structure of this particular organizational scheme for the information. So it has the definition of access structures. It also has the definition of the information types in it. So those two form a little pair, and you could stop right there, and you'd have a fully functional way of studying and implementing information structure. My schema defines the rules, and the instance implements the rules. But of course, we're going to go further, because no one except us, we architects, really wants to look at an instance file and get some information out of it, get human readable information out of it. So we have to use a third kind of file, the transform file. And the transform file transforms the XML into, you can walk through the camera, my students will like that. The third type of file, the transform file, transforms the XML instance into an end-user usable form. And that end-user readable form could be all sorts of things. In this class, we're going to focus on HTML. That's the major place that people use transforms to go from an XML instance file to an HTML file. That HTML file, now that leads us to the fourth and final kind of file that we'll be talking about in this class, part of the XML system, and that's the output file. So we can think of the schema instance system, and that's a schema and instance, one creating the rules, the other implementing the rules. We can also look at a instance transform output file system and say that the instance is the input, the transform does transformation, does work on that instance, and the output file is the human readable form that has a sub-selection of information from the instance and puts it in a form that end users can deal with. And in our case, as I said, that's mostly going to be HTML. But it could certainly be PDF, it could be text files, it could also actually be just a different form of XML. We can transform one schema into another schema, or an instance that behaves according to one schema into an instance that behaves according to another schema, as we desire. So lots of different kinds of output. The one we're going to focus on is HTML. Okay, that's the four different kinds of files: instances, schemas, transforms, and output files. And now let's talk a little bit about how those interact in a system. So I'll just give you the basic, really very introductory version of how this all works. And I'm also generalizing quite a bit, because there's many different ways of doing this, but I want to give you a mental model of what actually happens in an XML-based system that's on the web. So the user clicks on something on the web, right? That's what initiates any activity on the web. The user clicks on something. What happens when the user clicks? The user click contains, and we'll talk about this later in the course, but it contains parameters. It contains bits of information, little bits of information that say, what do I want to have happen? In our world, what we always are going to want to have happen is a certain transform is applied to a certain instance, a certain XML transform is applied to a certain instance, and the result is then put back down into the browser. right? That's what we want to specify. So the user clicks, somehow in that click, which I won't go into detail about now, the information of which instance we're talking about and which transform we're talking about is passed on to some program. There's a program living on the web server that does what you ask it to. And in this case, you've asked it to apply an instance to a transform. So typical set of steps that program will go through. It will load the instance. Loading means making it available for work. So making it ready, getting it off the hard drive and putting it in memory, right? So that's loading the instance. It very well might validate that instance. It might call up the accompanying schema and say, are you okay according to this schema? And if you're not, maybe send a message down saying, sorry, but this instance isn't really a valid instance. It's broken these rules, and so fix that before I can go any further. So step number 1, load the instance. Step number 2, possibly, not necessarily, but possibly validate it against the instance. You don't have to do that step if you're already positive that the instance is valid. Step number 3, load the transform. Use the transform that has been specified and apply it. That's the word we use. Apply the transform to the instance, and the result of that is going to be an output. That output in our case, in this scenario, is an HTML file, and now the server sends that HTML file back down the pipe and into the browser. Okay, and then that HTML file that's in the browser has other things you can click on. And the cycle continues. Click on something else, and that same process will happen. Load the instance, possibly validate it, definitely apply a transform to it, and send the result down the pipe. And of course, the result that's sent down the pipe has yet more things to click on. So round and around and around in that kind of loop. That's it.